a young perspective on hot-button issues around the world. This is The Hub.
The United States has now completed another withdrawal from Paris Climate Agreement. But this move goes far beyond climate policy. In recent years, the United States has increasingly stepped away from multilateral frameworks, especially since Trump came into office, not only in climate governance, but also across a wide range of international institutions. For much of the world, this raises deeper concerns about the erosion of multilateralism, the fragmentation of global governance, and whether existing international rules can still deliver fairness, stability, and shared responsibility. So what does the U.S. retreat from multilateral institutions really signal? And in a more divided world, how can global governance move forward rather than backward? To explore all these questions, we have with us from Chapel Hill, North Carolina in the United States, Professor Klaus Loris, Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina. From Shanghai, China, we have Shending Li, Professor at Fudan University's Institute of International Studies. And in Beijing, China, we have Ben Norton, Editor-in-Chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Now, Ben, let me ask you about this. Your reaction to the United States withdrawal from Paris Climate Agreement once again. Are we at a point of no return when it comes to undermining, eroding, and torpedoing the current international system?
Well, that's the fear that many people around the world have. And as you acknowledge, this is not the first time that Trump has withdrawn from this agreement or many other agreements. Let's not forget that Trump also withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. And this comes after just a few weeks ago, the U.S. government withdrew from more than 60 multilateral organizations and agreements. So this is part of a larger attack on multilateralism, the idea of multilateralism. And we see in Washington this emphasis when they say, make America great again and America first, they mean really America only. They mean that the U.S. is going to act in a unilateral way, whether that is attacking countries and abducting their leaders, as the U.S. did in Venezuela, whereas it's threatening to colonize Greenland, which is, territory of a NATO ally, Denmark. We see very egregious attacks on multilateralism as a concept. And basically the philosophy is that the U.S. can do whatever it wants and might makes right. And in fact, Trump himself was asked about international law, and he attacked international law and said it's not relevant and that he is guided by his own morality. So these are very egregious attacks indeed.
Right, that leads me to the next question about the cross-Atlantic alliance. Professor Loris in North Carolina, how do you look at all this? We've heard from the NATO Secretary General during the Davos World Economic Forum lamenting the status of the state of U.S. NATO alliance right now. Even though there can be a recession, agreement between NATO and the United States, chances are, there could be the fear is there could be permanent impact on NATO-American alliance. How do you look at all this?
Well, the transatlantic alliance is, of course, in deep crisis, and NATO is in deep crisis, and it has a lot to do with President Trump's policy. Trump doesn't like multilateral arrangements and agreements. He doesn't like to cooperate with a great number of other countries. He likes bilateral organizations, and he likes to talk bilaterally to foreign leaders. In that way, he can, of course, dominate the discussion, and that also applies to international organizations. He has treated the Europeans quite shabbily by, for example, as was already said just now, to threaten that he would like to annex Greenland, but in the past he also wanted to annex Canada, and he has referred to other countries which the United States just want to take over. In the end, then, Trump always went back on that claim that he wanted to do that. He did not follow through, but it undermines the international community. It undermines confidence in American reliability and predictability. And the Europeans have to react somehow, and so far they've only been able to react by being nice to Trump, by flattering Trump, because they are so dependent on the United States. Only in the Greenland case we noticed that the Europeans got their act together, became united, and actually stood up to Trump and told him in no uncertain way that invading or purchasing a NATO ally, that was unacceptable, that could not stand. And indeed Trump stood back from that claim, and they came to some sort of compromise agreement. So that really shows that if the transatlantic alliance, if the Europeans get their act together and are a little stronger and stand up to Trump, they can actually succeed. And I think that probably is the recipe for the future, not to simply meekly give in to Trump, but really stand up and argue with him in a reasonable way.
Well, Professor Loris, Trump only has 3 more years in the office if he does nothing to the U.S. Constitution, as he threatened that he would. Let's assume that 3 more years to go. Do you think the current crack between the United States and NATO and Western European countries is just a blip on the radar, or could there be a permanent damage done to cross-Atlantic alliance because of Trump?
It certainly is much more than a blip. It is a rupture of transatlantic relations, and the confidence, as I just said, the confidence in the United States among the European allies runs very deep. However, we don't know what Trump is going to do in the remaining 3 years, as you just indicated. If nothing too bad happens, then I think transatlantic relations can recover after Trump. But if something really terrible is done by the Trump administration, for example, like invading a NATO country, I think that would be the end of NATO, that would be the end of transatlantic alliance. But we have to see whether Trump can be placated, can be made more reasonable. He will still be, an unpredictable factor in world affairs, but he may not be too bad. On the other hand, he could do terrible things, and that would mean the end of NATO and the end of transatlantic relations. The jury is still out. We have to hope that Trump remains reasonable, that his advisors can influence him, particularly the Europeans can really talk sense into him, but there's no guarantee that that will actually be the case.
Yeah, one thing that we're sure of is we see a trend whereby Americans' allies and its leaders, kept coming to China. Beijing received visiting heads of state and heads of governments, including the Irish Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister. The visit is still pending, of course. Canadian Prime Minister Carney visited China. Most recently, have the Finnish Prime Minister Petteri Orpo paying an official visit to China as we speak. So, Professor Shen in Shanghai, do you see, China on the recipient end of America's aggressive and abrasive foreign policy, pushing many of its allies towards, the side of Beijing, on top of the fact that China has been making proactive efforts, if you think about President Xi's 4 global initiatives?
Well, the Chinese perspective might be it's a crucial time that China should more play its leading role on the world stage by advancing multilateralism, by emphasizing global governance. The more America is unwilling to play its normal role, the more the rest of the country, including China, should strengthen their effort by working on a multilateral system in order to sustain global prosperity and stability. So it's our time to lead.
But in what concrete ways? I mean, China has been part of this, the BRICS circle, this SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Circle, Belt and Road Initiative on infrastructure and trade. How would you assess China's leadership?
Well, for instance, the U.S. has recently again withdrawn from Paris Agreement and WHO. That means China should stay there. China should advance its science, technology, research in medical science in order to provide more public goods for global healthcare. So China has a big space because America has vacated its own space. The world needs China, needs Britain, Canada working together. And we may be patient a bit because after a while, the U.S. pro-cooperation political force may re-emerge, may return to the White House. So we should not abandon that this is the end of America and the end of the world. We should not feel frustrated. At this time, we lose Americans' participation. That may mean China may give more resource and effort to work with the rest of the world. So we may bear this short-term hardship to prepare for a longer new world order in which America may or may not be an element anymore.
You know, that really makes people think about the middle powers, or so-called, and their options. So Ben, we've heard from the Canadian Prime Minister Carney at Davos making a very impressive speech calling on middle powers to stand up to basically stand up to bully and to stand up to Trump's America. So where do you think the middle powers, the middle countries will go? I mean, how will Trump's foreign policy make their recalibrate their alliance system and their partnerships going forward?
That's a great question. It could go several different ways. I will first say that we should keep in mind that Canada's Prime Minister Carney gave this historic speech at the World Economic Forum just a few days after he came to China, and he met with Chinese leadership and announced what he called a new world order. So we see that, you know, these middle powers, as he called them, like Canada and European countries, recognize that the global order has shifted in some profound ways, and they have to adjust their foreign policy accordingly. Now, that said, I should point out that Europeans have been talking about this for at least a decade, going back even before Trump's first term, but especially in Trump's first term. Angela Merkel in Germany and Emmanuel Macron in France were talking about the idea of strategic autonomy. They even proposed the concept of creating a pan-European army. So there's been discussion of this, but very few results have come out of it. However, it does seem that this could potentially be a breaking point. After all, Trump is now threatening to attack and potentially colonize the territory of a fellow NATO member. Now, what's also interesting about Carney's speech at Davos is he acknowledged that what they call the so-called rules-based international order has been deeply hypocritical, and that global South countries have been criticizing this order and defending international law. And it's important to distinguish these 2 points because the international law-based order is very clearly defined. It's, you know, the United Nations is at the heart of it. We all know what international law is. And yet we've seen in recent years an attempt by some of the Western countries to replace that with what they call the rules-based order. And yet now the Trump administration is even throwing that out and trying to go completely on its own. Trump is actually trying to create an alternative to the UN with this so-called Board of Peace. So this is a very profound shift that we've seen just in a few years. And this could potentially be the breaking point that pushes the so-called middle powers to actually pursue what they call strategic autonomy.
Talking about the Board of Peace or the Committee of Peace, we see dozens of countries, if not more, signing up to it, behind Trump at an event in Davos, Switzerland. Countries including Azerbaijan, Pakistan, some of them aligned with China strategically and in terms of trade. They're now signing up to Trump's Board of Peace. What do you make of that, Ben?
Well, it's still very early. I think this is a diplomatic move by some countries that have expressed interest because they don't want to be targeted by Trump. Many of them are concerned about tariffs and trade issues. But we'll see how deep their commitment is because we still don't know exactly what this organization is. But from some of the reporting, it looks like Trump is trying to create a competitor to the United Nations that the U.S. controls, and other countries have to pay Trump and pay the U.S. to be a member of this organization. This is very dangerous because it's a full frontal attack on international law itself, on the institutions created after World War II that were ostensibly supposed to stop more global wars and more conflicts. But as for the countries that have expressed interest, many of these countries have leaders that are closely allied with Trump personally, in countries like Hungary. But in the cases of other countries, I think what they're simply doing is they're using this as a kind of diplomatic card that they can play so they can, reduce some of the tensions they have with the United States and with Trump.
Exactly. I mean, after all, people are risk averse, so are our nation states. Now, Professor Loris, what do you make of Trump's board of peace, or efforts scrambling to create a alternative to the United Nations system? Will Trump succeed? Will countries sign up to it?
Well, I don't really make all that much of it. Trump clearly wants to be the head of the world, and he wants to continue in that role once he has left office in 3 years' time. Many countries, many big countries have not signed up, have refused to sign up, like, for example, France. The Germans probably will also not sign up. Canada, Trump has thrown out himself again. No Palestinians have been on the board, so of course it was all about originally it was all about resolving the Gaza conflict. So I will predict that the Board of Peace will disappear in due course, that it will not become a major international organization, that simply it will become, weak, and then people will forget about it. And I think Trump himself will probably forget about it. But if I may just add something about the middle powers, I think the problem with the middle powers is that they have nowhere else to go. At least the European middle powers, they are still, despite all their industrial efforts in the recent past, their defense efforts in the recent past, they are totally dependent still on the security umbrella and also the nuclear umbrella of the United States. So they cannot afford to become totally independent and turn away from the United States. They are developing strategic autonomy, but they have been doing that for quite some time, and it will take another 10, 15 years if something like defense autonomy can be achieved by the Europeans. So essentially they are dependent on sticking closely with their alliance, with their partnership with the United States. In economic terms, this is slightly different, and here they are indeed looking around. They are diversifying their economic and trade relations, and you rightly said a number of European heads of states and heads of governments are coming to China. They certainly want to check out what they can do regarding trade and economic relations with China, how they can improve relations. But of course, this is not all free from tension either. The Germans, for example, at the moment have a very weak economy. They are losing 10,000 manufacturing jobs per month, and their exports of luxury limousines to China have dropped by over 40%. And for the first time in years, the Germans are running actually a trade deficit with China. So when Chancellor Merz is coming to China later in February, he will talk about these problems, and he will hope that he and China can actually agree some sort of compromise where the German economy can be helped by China, so that they can actually export more and lose much fewer manufacturing jobs. And I think these problems need to be addressed, and these problems probably will be addressed by Merz's visit to China, for example. But it's not easy. It's not just turning around or turning away from the United States, going to China, going to India, going to other countries. It really is a very complex situation, and the dependency on the United States also in trade and economic relations and security relations of Europe is quite strong still.
Right, because Carney of Canada, the Prime Minister, proposed a selective alliance. You pick China for trade, you pick the United States for nuclear umbrella, and you pick China again for investment, and you pick the United States for other things. More realism-based, need-based, necessity-based realism going forward. And he also talked about the West should drop hypocrisy, claiming that they're still abiding by this so-called rules-based international order. Like Ben said, it was a brilliant speech. Now, Professor Shen, in terms of the United States disrupting the current world order, what exactly do you think China has to offer?
China would stick to its global governance. All countries on the Earth planet should work as one unity. And so America is less interested in playing its dual role. China, as a responsible stakeholder, would still committed to what it has stated in working the rest of the world, especially global south, for prosperity, infrastructure, and poverty eradication. And China would advance its own science, technology, medical achievements in order to prepare better public goods for its own people and for the rest of the world. Of course, we're happy to provide ours to American people. And personally, I think U.S. still has many future possibilities. The worst is to abandon United Nations, to quit NATO, as Trump seemed to make a joke. He stated, the UN and NATO pose the biggest threat to America. So since it's an old friend and the institution it has created has become the arch enemy to America. So if the world would keep countering America, it's not impossible that America would abandon them. Then the rest of the world may vote that Beijing may host the new headquarters of United Nations. So China may not compete for this, but this is maybe not a distant possibility. And if NATO is abandoned by America, NATO has to follow Trump's argument that they have to pay more for their own defense. And at that time, they may also come to China. They may ask China to join NATO, to be a part of NATO in order to defend NATO. And China would reduce a concern. NATO would support America in a future Taiwan kind of a contingency. So American quitting of the world system may endanger the world, but may also make the world to be more resilient, to be more independent of America, and make the world better. So I hope the rest of America may, through their own internal deliberation, discover what will be a better, more effective, and a more brilliant world Americans should opt for. So this is a crucial time that China, US, and all the world should think about this.
Professor Loris, do you think that the West got China right? You know, my Western friends, or our Western friends, have always, they tend to be, portrayed China as this aggressive and somehow evil power aiming to take over the world and overpowering the United States, replacing it in more ways than one. Do you think they got China right? Or China could potentially really stand up to the occasion, step up to the occasion, and become a legitimate alternative on the global stage, especially when it comes to trade, investment, international lawmaking?
Well, China will certainly become one of the world's largest powers. It already is one of the most influential and politically interesting powers in the world, and that progress, that rise will probably continue further. I don't think that many people think of China as an aggressive power, but they think of China as also a great power. And great powers like the United States, like the Europeans, like India and many other countries, they above all pursue their own interests. You know, China is not unselfish. The United States under Trump definitely is not unselfish. But the European countries, they are also acting in their own interest. And I think that has become clear during the last few years when we look at what Trump is doing, that great powers are pursuing their own great interest. And so everyone, I think, will look around and say, in some respects, yes, we can rely on China and work and cooperate with China, but in some respects, we are better off cooperating with the Europeans. And I think we are in a new world where really countries will select their partners. They will not enter into permanent alliances and permanent friendships and rivalries, but they will shop around and sometimes cooperate with China, sometimes cooperate with the United States or with other countries like the European Union and India. And I think that is a new world we are in. It is a multilateral world and probably a multipolar world, but still the United States and China are probably more equal than anyone else in that world because they are more influential, they are more powerful, also militarily, but also, of course, economically. And that new global order, which has been talked about so often in the recent past, that may gradually actually develop. And a lot of people in the United States, sometimes even within Trump's circle, Sometimes they talk about a G2 world, a world of the great two powers, China and the United States. Whether that is realistic, I don't know, because the so-called middle powers, including the Europeans, will of course not really be part of such a world. It is supposed to be a multipolar, a multilateral world, not a G2 world. Whether something like that will develop or not, we will have to see. And perhaps one final word about Trump. When we talk about the United States and its, not particularly wise foreign policy of the last 12 months, we are talking about the Trump administration. And the Trump administration has a popularity rating of less than 40%, often 38, 37, 36%. So it is not the majority of Americans who actually like that sort of aggressive, assertive and unilateral foreign policy. It is actually quite controversial within the United States, and generally it is expected that the Republicans will lose the midterm elections this November and possibly also lose the next general election. So I guess there is hope on the horizon that the unilateralism and the very selfish policy of the Trump administration will not last forever.
Thank you, gentlemen. That's all the time we have. See you next time.